Hello everybody, long time no see on this channel at least, because I'm very active in other places, but I am coming to you today with, I suppose, like a new mini-series where I basically answer your questions. I have to say that over 3 months ago now, I made it available to people to ask me questions, and it was supposed to be like a big Q&A session that I was going to do, but then things have kind of changed. A lot has happened around I guess the things I'm comfortable with doing online in that moment. So all in all, I decided to kind of drop the big Q&A format, and instead I decided to go through the questions that were asked to me and just cherry pick some of those that I found interesting, some of those that I didn't already answer in some other of my videos or content elsewhere, and try to answer them one per video. So hopefully this format is going to be shorter than my usual videos, and we are going to be looking at some of the topics that I usually kind of deal with in my practice as a practitioner of Polish folk magic. The question for today that I picked is something that I don't see being often talked about. So let's read the question and let's get to it. Do you translate spells or invocations to Polish, or do you leave it in original language? Since Witchcraft is more about being rooted in your place, I'm curious to know if Genius Loci would understand me speaking English, or are they like, what the fuck is that human all about? And I think this is a great question. I am pretty sure this was asked by a Polish person, because the way they worded it, I don't know if you're watching this or not, hopefully you do, so you can get your answer. But the way you word this kind of makes me seem like you are mostly familiar with traditional witchcraft resources being available in English, which is why the question about translation of the invocation spells and so on. But I think it's interesting to tackle the subject of the use of language within one's practice in general, especially if you want to practice something that's kind of rooted in a place where a different language is spoken than the one you speak, right? But also because a lot of the things we see in folkloric magic, in traditional witchcraft, is kind of also similar, like across Europe, for example. So you might want to cross-reference sources, get inspired by something from somewhere else, etc. But how do you actually apply that to the place where you are, so that it's relevant to the spirits you work with and the land that you are connecting with, hopefully, in your craft? I would like to speak to this from my personal experience. I am somebody who does my spoken stuff in magic primarily in Polish, so in my native language. I don't like to use English in my craft. I find that it's not appropriate, and to be frank with you, it does feel a tiny bit cringy for me personally to use the English language while speaking to the spirits, the ancestors, the land here where I live. But perhaps it's not for the reasons that you might think. And here I would like to kind of break it down in terms of how I perceive it personally. I don't think that the spirits of the land and spirits that were never human, basically, that they have those limitations of language the same way as humans do, or like, for example, spirits of the dead do, because, you know, we grow up with language or languages, and they shape who we are, they shape how we perceive reality, how we address others as well, and how we relate, basically, right? So language and anything that's spoken when applied to the practice of folk magic or witchcraft, it carries tremendous power. And I speak to that more in my lecture about zamawiania, so spoken charms from the Polish folk magic side of the spectrum, I suppose. So if you're interested in that, please feel free to check that out on my Patreon. You know, language is very powerful. And now I think that spirits themselves, as I said, if they are non-human, they never were related to humans directly or stemming from them. I think it's not as important to them, the human language that you choose to speak to them or address them with. I think that the communication with non-human spirits transcends human language because they obviously never learned it in the same way that we do. I think spirits of the land, local land where you live, might probably be the most accustomed to hearing the native language of the area because of people, humans, speaking to them in that language most often. But I also think if you use other languages or other forms of communication, because communication doesn't need to be verbal per se, the messages or the dialogue that happens between you and the spirit is kind of translated along the way into forms that can be understood by the other party. And I mean this both ways, because if a spirit communicates with you, they don't necessarily use your language to do so, but what you receive from them, you understand through your understanding of the world and through the language that you know, obviously. This is kind of maybe easier to understand if you look at spirit communication through tools like divination tools, for example. They obviously are non-verbal methods of communication, but through symbols, for example, or specific moves or other signals that are easy to interpret and you know what they actually mean, you can construct and kind of translate those messages that you are getting into a human language that you can understand and therefore actually receive what is being told to you, right? So in this capacity, I suppose, I don't think it's that important to speak the language of the area because communication with spirits happens through other channels than human verbal language. But now here's the thing, if you are speaking words of power, so like zamawiania, enchantments, spells, invocations, prayers, etc., I think for the purpose of witchcraft practice, they need to hold power. And you, the one who is speaking, your vocal cords vibrating those sounds, making them come out of you, you as the channel for that need to feel that those words hold power. And now the question is, what holds power to you? What makes a spell or an invocation or a prayer be powerful? What makes it feel like it carries a load of something actually and is not just empty on the inside? That's something that only you can answer yourself. For me, in my practice, again, that means that I mostly use the Polish language. I don't use English, but I also use Latin sometimes, or sometimes something that's called Barbarous words, which are words that belong to no language, and some would maybe say that that's gibberish because that's kind of what it is. It's on the verge. It carries a load of something, but it's not communicated verbally per se. It's communicated through the kind of power of the vocal cords creating that tension and that message that's then kind of sent outwards of your body, if that makes sense. It's kind of hard for me to find proper words for how I see this in English, but that's kind of the best I can do here, I suppose. So going back to the original question now, do I translate invocations, prayers, spells from other languages to Polish to use in my craft? Yes, I do, although I don't do that as often as people might think. I think in Poland especially, people are kind of taught that traditional language, the way to access it is through English sources only. And namely, that's usually like the Troy Books authors, that you can access that. That is not true. You just need to understand. I think those are a good base, because you can understand what traditional witchcraft is, and then find that in your native language. On, for example, the Polish ground, you have a lot of sources that speak about the same types of practices, and that's your local traditional witchcraft. And that's the enchantments, zamawiania again, right? Spells, etc., that have been used traditionally locally here for hundreds of years. And that is available to you. And always, for me at least, when I choose historically documented forms of like enchantments, etc., I always try to find something that would be an equivalent. Like, for example, I find something in English, I try to find an equivalent that comes from Poland. And it's not as hard as you may think. It's just something that you kind of need to know where to look to find those things. So I would like to show you a few books and kind of tell you what's up with that and how I go about that as well. So starting off with my own book, actually, this is my, like you could say, grimoire. This is actually where I write down the spoken formulas that I use in my craft. Some of those are derived from Polish traditional sources. Some of those are my own, channeled from spirit communication or just written by me, and some of those as well, but that's a minority, are actually translated from English to Polish for my own use, okay? And this is something that I find really handy, because I don't want to be flicking through random books while doing some kind of working. I want to have something on hand that's been kind of prepared in advance, and a book like this is really helpful for that. Now, when it comes to the things that I can share that I actually translated for my own use, and it worked well, so it can be easily applied in my practice, is, for example, from Gemma, from the Devil's Dozen. I do use one of the invocations of the devil, so a spoken enchantment to invite the devil for the purpose of communing through ritual. So I translated that from English to Polish, and I actually use it in my craft, and it's actually helpful and it works for me. Now, another source that I really love is the Witch's Art of Incantation by Roger Horne. This is a great compendium of traditionally used spoken formulas of all kinds, mostly from Scotland, I think, but many of those are also from other regions of Europe. Personally, I use some of those as well, translated to Polish. One of my favorite ones is the Black Paternoster, which is kind of like one of those traditional spoken charms used in Scottish folk magic and traditional witchcraft. And when translated to Polish, it actually resembles some of the prayers that we say here as well. So I really love that, and I highly recommend this book as something that's actually usable no matter the language you speak. But when it comes to Polish sources, if you happen to be Polish or happen to be speaking the Polish language and want to use it in your craft, I would first of all suggest this book, Trzy, Zorze, Dziewicze. This one has quite a lot of examples of historically documented zamawiania, so spoken charms that you can use in your craft, and some of them are really similar to other such charms and spoken spells used in other regions of Europe. So I think some of those are really kind of universal across Europe, and here you can find historically documented Polish examples of those. And lastly, this book, it's an absolute treasure trove when it comes to, again, spoken spells, enchantments, zamawiania for healing, for protection, even some things like on the verge of dealing with curses, etc. This book, the Lecznictwo Ludu Polskiego, it's quite thick, okay? So it has a lot of examples. And again, some of those are documented to be used across Europe, like for example the Sator Square, maybe you're familiar with that. And there's, you know, just plenty of that good stuff. So again, if you come from Poland or if you speak the Polish language, you really don't have to translate things from English to Polish to use something that's more folk magic or tradcrafty. We actually have our own sources, and I think for me, everybody can judge this based on their personal preference, I think. But for me, it's important to rely on sources that are local and, you know, try to make the craft actually bioregionally relevant. Okay, that's how I would put it, I guess. And for that purpose, I think it's always better to reach for local sources instead of trying to import something from abroad, especially if that something is not necessarily, you know, a historical expression of formulas used in the craft, but oftentimes these are formulas written by the authors in the present day for the purpose of their own kind of modern expression of traditional witchcraft. I think what people don't understand is that the traditional witchcraft, as is kind of most known in the witchcraft spheres, so like for example the things that you see from Gemma or Nigel Pearson, other folks from like Troy books, as well as, you know, some books that were written on American ground, like for example the Besom Stangen sword, etc. That kind of traditional witchcraft is not ancient. This is something that's modern, and it's actually even more modern than Wicca. And I think this is not spoken about that much, actually. I think it's kind of this thing that people just like to assume that traditional witchcraft, the way I just described it, is kind of ancient and whatever. But the truth is that if you're looking for something like that, traditional witchcraft is not that thing. What you're looking for is folk magic of your region. That's where you find an actual historical expression of the craft that has been utilized by, you know, generations of your ancestors for many, many years, for centuries, really. So know the history of the occult and of magic and witchcraft to spot that kind of thing, and know that if you translate a modern practitioner's invocation or spell or whatever, it's no better than if you wrote your own. Just keep that in mind, and maybe don't glorify those people that much because they are just like you, okay? That's all I'm going to say on the subject. I hope I answered your question. And yeah, see you around. Bye.